All right, so today we start a new section of class, Metaphysics Part 1. Now, recall from our very first week of class the booklet entitled The Nature of Philosophy. Here we identified the four main areas or divisions of philosophy. So first there's metaphysics, right, which is the study of the nature of reality and being. In other words, it asks, what is there? Then there's epistemology, right, which is the study of the nature of knowledge. It asks, how do we know? We have ethics, which is the study of good character and conduct, asking the question, how should we live? And lastly, there's the area of philosophy, that is logic. It's the study of the structure of valid reasoning, asking, how do we think and reason critically? Now, the analogy of the divided line by Plato begins our introduction to philosophical metaphysics. And like the allegory of the cave, the analogy of the divided line is also from Plato's Republic. It's from Book 6. The analogy was from Book 7. And just like in the allegory of the cave, here in the analogy, even though Socrates is the central speaker, Plato is the author of the text, right? So we're learning about Plato's ideas, not Socrates' ideas. Now, in the analogy, Plato proposes a theory about reality, namely that reality is divided into two realms, two orders or regions of being. Right? We have the sensible and the intelligible, or the non-sensible. Thus, Plato's theory of reality can be described as metaphysical dualism, a theory that reality is divided into two types of being or two types of reality. More, Plato argues that the intelligible part of reality is more real than the sensible part. So not only is reality divided into two realms of being, but there is a hierarchy built into reality, a hierarchy of less real and more real orders of being. So how do we apprehend or access or come to know the sensible or visible realm of being? Well, the stuff that exists in the sensible realm are apprehended through our senses. In other words, through seeing, hearing, touching, smelling, and tasting. And what about the intelligible realm? How do we apprehend or access or come to know the intelligible realm of reality or being? Well, the beings that exist in the intelligible, non-sensible realm are apprehended through the intellect, right? Through thinking and reasoning and understanding. Therefore, the entities found in the intelligible realm, they can be grasped by the mind, but not perceived by the senses. All right, and so what does Plato call these intelligible but not sensible beings? Right, the forms or the ideas. Right, we refer to them as the Platonic forms. And so Plato proposes that the forms, which exist in the intelligible realm of reality, are more real than the stuff that exists here in the sensible, visible realm. Right, and so what sort of beings are those? Well, all the ordinary beings of the physical world that we encounter and experience on a daily basis. All right, so how else can we describe these two distinct realms of reality? Well, the sensible realm of being, it's material, it's physical, it's visible, temporal, spatial, and it's temporary. And the intelligible or non-sensible realm of being is immaterial, non-physical, invisible, non-temporal, in other words, eternal, non-spatial, in other words, it doesn't exist in any sort of place that you can get to, and it's permanent. The beings of the sensible realm, they always change and decay. They're always coming into and going out of existence. They exist within space and time. They are imperfect and unstable, right? So they're physical objects, living things. Any entity or being which, quote, takes up space. Any being which can be sensed, right, with our eyes, ears, sense of touch, and so on. And so these are all the ordinary, everyday beings of our physical reality. While the beings of the intelligible realm, right, the Platonic forms, they never change, they never decay. They don't come into or go out of existence. They exist outside of space and time, and they are perfect and stable and law-like. And so these are abstract entities. The forms are very similar to concepts, except the forms are not merely just names and categories or linguistic constructs that we humans come up with to describe the world. Rather, they are really existing entities which exist outside of the mind. And so that's really heady and confusing, but it'll become clearer as we go. So in the text, Socrates, right, again, Plato, he maps out the dualistic nature of reality by drawing a line that's divided into two segments, right? This is the divided line. And this divided line represents these two aspects of being, right? The intelligible and the sensible. He then further divides each segment, thus producing a line with 4 total segments, and we can identify each segment with the letters D, C, B, and A. Segment D represents imperfect being, while segment A represents more perfect being. All right, but there's more. Because in addition to the first line, which represents what there is a corresponding line which maps out how we know it. In other words, how we access or apprehend the stuff that will go on that line. All right, so these two lines then reflect metaphysics on the left and epistemology, right? The difference between what there is and how we come to know it, apprehend it, cognize it, so on. All right, so let's start filling out the lines and the segments of the lines. Starting with segment D, which is the lowest grade of reality, right? The stuff that's the least real. And the beings that exist here in subsection D, what types of beings does Plato propose go here? Well, he says things like shadows and reflections, illusions, and imagined things like unicorns. In other words, distorted imitations of things themselves. Okay, so why is this section D? Why is the lowest grade of reality? Well, imagine this sort of knowledge gained by looking at shadows, right? So consider the shadow of a tree. Just the shadow, right? You can see the basic shape of its branches, but depending on the light source, it's going to change shape. And so by looking just at the shadow, you don't actually know the real shape of the tree. And so what's the mode of knowing associated with this portion of the line? Right? It's the epistemic state of imagining, Plato tells us. Right? The state of being, the epistemic state of knowing that is associated with imagining, it allows the mind to apprehend the lowest grade of reality. And so, for instance, create in your mind's eye an image of whatever it was you had for breakfast, whether it was oatmeal or cereal or whatever else, right? That image that you're creating in your mind, it's very unstable. It's hard to sustain. It's like a fleeting kind of glimpse that comes and goes. It doesn't persist, right? So it has very, very little reality, right? You can't really investigate it even, the image in your mind. Okay, now subsection C is larger than subsection D, so there's more things that are going to exist here. But this subsection C still corresponds to the realm of the visible, sensible, material region of being. Right? And so Plato says that, well, in this section are physical living things, right? Physical things or living things. In other words, that which is the source of reflections or images. So, you know, your car is like in the parking lot or in your driveway, right? That would be a being that's in segment C. But then you can produce an image of your car in your imagination, right? That would be section D. And so what's the mode of knowing associated with this portion of the line? Plato calls it the epistemic state of belief, right? Believing what you see and believing that what you see is real. The epistemic state of belief allows us to apprehend physical objects of the sensible world. Our beliefs are often based on information presented to our senses, right? You hear my voice, so you believe that it's there, right? The breakfast that you imagine in your mind's eye, you don't actually believe that it's real, right? You're not going to be confused that you can't grab a hold of it and eat it, right? So belief is grounded in our senses, Plato tells us. Okay, so now this is important. Plato is really skeptical about how reliable knowledge is if that knowledge is based on sense experience. That is to say, he's skeptical of what's called empirical knowledge. Plato doesn't think our senses and our sense experiences of the world, he doesn't think it actually gives us genuine knowledge. And so why not? Why might Plato be skeptical of beliefs that are derived from our sense experiences? Well, ask yourself this. Do our senses ever deceive us? It seems like, yeah, they kind of do all the time. In fact, we constantly have to supervise or regulate the kind of brute, raw data and information that the visible world presents to our senses. We don't even realize we're doing it half the time, but we have to do it because our senses appear to give us an unreliable version of reality. Right? For example, the raw data that is presented to my senses tells me that far away people are only 2 inches tall, right? No bigger than my thumb. And the raw data I get from my senses tells me that if I put a pencil in the water, that it's broken. All right, consider some of these examples of our senses being kind of really funky. Right? Ask, what word do you hear? Green needle or brainstorm? And focus first on green needle, and then focus on brainstorm, and see if what you're hearing actually changes. All right, now ask yourself, what is the choir singing?
That is embarrassing! 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 That is embarrassing!
All right, so here's another example.
Stare at the middle of these two pictures above. You will still see the faces, but your mind is going to combine the two faces together. So while you're staring in the middle of these two pictures, the two faces on the side are going to look extremely weird.
So, those wacky images, that's what our senses are presenting to us. Now, we can kind of investigate why this happens, but just generally, Plato will draw the conclusion that our sense experiences and the data we get from our senses is not a reliable indication of what reality is actually like. So the pencil is bent, and yet it isn't bent. The man is small, and yet he isn't small. The voice is saying brainstorm, and yet it isn't saying brainstorm. Right? In other words, the entities that exist in the sensible region, right, whatever gets apprehended through our sense faculties, they're like chaotic mixtures of being one thing and non-being that thing, right? Nothing is ever perfectly what it is here in the kind of sensible realm of reality, ordinary reality. And so the beings that exist here for Plato, they are not good in the sense that they are not perfect. So the epistemic state associated with section C is limited to mere belief, not knowledge. And together, subsections D and C give us opinion, not knowledge. All right, they give us an opinion of what is real, not knowledge of what is real. Okay, so this brings us then, moving up the line, to segment B, the intelligent realm. And so what exists here are objects of comprehension as opposed to objects of sensation. They are invisible, immaterial, non-physical, eternal entities. And so Plato considers them to be abstract entities, like mathematical and other forms, and other conceptual forms, right? They are abstract entities that we comprehend with the help of representations, diagrams, and images. So, for example, the forms of geometry, like the square and the triangle, when comprehended with the aid of diagrams. But also ethical and aesthetic forms, when abstracted from particular representations. So, for instance, there's like the form of courage itself, which is different from particular instantiations of courage. But we can come to understand courage when comprehended with the help of a particular representation of courage in a, for instance, death-defying feat. That's not courage itself. It's a particular instance or example, or if this were mathematics, we would say like a diagram or a representation of courage. But we can begin to think about what courage is with the help of examples, right? And there's the form of beauty itself. Beauty itself is very different from any particular beautiful thing. But we can consider the form of beauty itself and comprehend it with the aid, with the help of a particular representation of beauty in an epic landscape with music, for instance. Or there's the form of excellence itself, what the Greeks would call virtue. And we can comprehend excellence itself with the aid of particular representations of excellence, like, for instance, through the gold medal figure skater.
Shook me, feeling me, singing from heartache, from the pain, taking my message from the veins, speaking my lesson from the brain, seeing the beauty through the... Hey, you make me a believer.
So again, these are all particular examples or representations of beauty and courage and excellence, but they're not the thing itself. They're not beauty itself or courage itself. They're diagrams or representations they're examples that help us consider and help us comprehend the intellectual entity itself. Now, then we have to ask, what is the mode of knowing that's associated with apprehending the forms, right, in section B, when they are apprehended with the help of aids and representations? And Plato says it's the epistemic state of thought, right? In other words, this epistemic state allows us to use diagrams and representations and examples that are found here in the sensible realm, and we can use them as stepping stones to contemplate the abstract entity itself, which is purely theoretical or intellectual and doesn't exist in time and space. So diagrams and representations and examples, they help us contemplate the nature of the non-sensible form. But again, this is important. The abstract entity itself, beauty itself, is something that only the mind can grasp. And so Plato recognizes that mathematical knowledge is the closest thing to real knowledge that we have here in this world. So perfect lines, perfect triangles, perfect circles, these geometrical entities simply do not exist in a three-dimensional, visible, sensible world. Yet we can nonetheless conceive them with our intellect, right? No one's ever going to discover the number 2, but we can conceive what the number 2 is. So when we first embark on the study of mathematics, for example, we have to rely on the help of diagrams and representations to understand the nature of the mathematical object. But this is what's so important. Again, even though the diagrams exist here in the visible world, our mind is not directed at the diagram of the triangle. Our mind is directed at the triangle itself, and the diagram is just a stepping stone to help us understand the nature of the triangle, or the nature of the Pythagorean theorem, or whatever it happens to be. All right, so then moving on up, this brings us to the final subsection of the divided line. That's the region that has the most reality. And what sort of entities or beings belong here? Well, the Platonic forms themselves, right? That is, the abstract beings, the square itself, beauty itself, but when those beings are comprehended, right, through reason alone, without the help of diagrams and without the help of examples. And the mode of knowing that's associated with this portion of the line, Plato says it's the epistemic state of reason, right? Plato calls it dialectic. It's pure reason or pure thought, as opposed to the type of thought that requires representations and examples and diagrams of the forms. And so together, section A and B give us actual knowledge, while section C and D, again, gives us only opinion. And so Plato kind of proposes the following. If we are well trained in philosophy, then we can apprehend the genuine knowledge of beauty itself, or justice itself, courage itself, etc. And so behind or beyond the wild variety of particular courageous acts that we perceive in the world, there is just one unchanging form of courage itself, right? And so take, for instance, the form of beauty itself. In order to comprehend the form of beauty itself, we will have to initially rely on particular examples of beautiful things, like a beautiful poem, a beautiful body, a beautiful landscape, right? And that's what's represented in section B, understanding beauty itself through the example of its like manifestation in particular things in the visible world. But then we abstract from those examples the qualities that all beautiful things share. And so it is the purely abstract form of beauty which all particular beautiful things somehow participate in, right? Think about how wildly different a sunset is from your favorite poem, right? Two incredibly different sorts of things, right? Or the beautiful painting on the one hand, and the beautiful feeling that you have when you see your friend and you haven't been with in a long time. Somehow they're both participating in beauty. Nonetheless, they're very wildly kind of different, right? But they're somehow sharing in the abstract nature of beauty itself. Or we can consider something like justice, right? We can understand the unchanging nature of justice itself, and once we do so, then we can kind of move back down that divided line and put our knowledge of justice to use in order to guide how we live and how we arrange society back here in the physical material world, right? So you've got the one movement up the line, then we can kind of glimpse and understand the forms themselves and then move back down the line. It's sort of like coming back down into the cave with our knowledge of the forms. Okay, so that's it for the first video lecture, and the next lectures will address more detail about Plato's theory of the forms and also his idea of the meaning of the form of the good.